Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Appalachian Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know how far and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1851 when the first reports began to surface about strange disappearances in the dense forests of McDowell County, West Virginia. Wealthy landowners, those who ventured too deep into the mountain hollows, would sometimes vanish without explanation. Local authorities initially attributed these disappearances to the treacherous terrain, steep ravines, unexpected sinkholes, and the unforgiving wilderness that had claimed many lives before. But as winter approached that year, a pattern emerged that could no longer be ignored. A pattern that led back to a man whose name was barely whispered in proper society. A former slave who had escaped into the mountains and was rumored to have developed an uncanny ability to make those who pursued him simply disappear. The first documented case involved a landowner named Thomas Hale, whose family owned a substantial tobacco plantation on the fertile valley floor. According to county records discovered in 1962, Hale had reported the escape of a slave identified only as Elijah in July of 1851. What made this case unusual was Hale's personal insistence on leading the pursuit himself, rather than employing professional slave catchers, as was customary among men of his standing. According to a journal kept by Hale's wife Sarah, discovered decades later during renovations to the old Hale homestead, her husband had developed what she described as an unusual fixation with recapturing this particular man. Thomas speaks of nothing else, she wrote, and has taken to studying maps of the mountains with a fervor I have never before witnessed in him. There is something in his eyes when he speaks of Elijah that frightens me more than the thought of a runaway in our hills. What we know of Elijah Brown comes primarily from plantation records, church registries, and the scattered recollections of those who encountered him. Born on the Hale plantation around 1823, he was described in purchase records as uncommonly intelligent and skilled with tools. Unlike other enslaved individuals on the plantation, Elijah had been permitted to learn rudimentary carpentry and engineering, as Thomas Hale had recognized his unusual aptitude for mechanical problems and put these skills to use building various structures around the property. According to employment records found in the Hale family archive, Elijah had been responsible for designing and constructing a series of innovative irrigation systems that had significantly increased the plantation's productivity. On August 3, 1851, Thomas Hale assembled a small party of 5 men and departed for the mountains with provisions for a week's journey. According to what remains of his expedition journal, he was confident in their ability to track and recapture Elijah, writing on the first evening, "The mountains may seem vast to some, but to a man with determination and knowledge of his quarry's habits, they will surrender their secrets. I know how Elijah thinks. I know where he will go." The journey was expected to last no more than 5 days. When 2 weeks passed without word, Sarah Hale requested assistance from neighboring plantations. A search party was organized, comprised of 12 men experienced in mountain travel. They found the remains of Hale's camp on the eastern slope of what is now known as Beartown Mountain. The site appeared to have been abandoned in haste, with personal belongings and provisions left behind. Of Thomas Hale and his companions, there was no trace. The search continued for nearly a month before being abandoned as winter approached. Sarah Hale would later write in her diary that she had dreams where she heard her husband's voice calling from inside the mountain itself, as though the earth had swallowed him whole, yet kept him living within its belly. Throughout the winter of 1851 and into the spring of 1852, rumors began to spread through McDowell County about a solitary figure occasionally glimpsed on the mountain ridges. A trapper named Josiah Miller, whose account was recorded in the McDowell County Register in March of 1852, described encountering a complex system of ropes and pulleys attached to the trees near Bear Wallow Gap, fashioned with such ingenuity that I stood in admiration for some time before realizing the grim purpose such a device might serve. By summer, the story of Elijah Brown had transformed from a simple case of a runaway slave to something that kept the plantation owners in the region awake at night. Local hunters reported finding strange configurations of branches and rope that they initially mistook for animal snares, but which seemed designed for much larger prey. Some began to avoid sending their overseers or slave catchers into certain parts of the mountains. Others doubled their efforts, offering substantial rewards for the capture of the man now referred to in private correspondence as the Mountain Man. What is particularly notable about this period is how the tenor of the written records changes. Letters between plantation owners, preserved in the state historical archives, begin to reference Elijah not as property to be recovered, but as something approaching an adversary to be feared. One such letter, written by plantation owner Frederick Wilson to his cousin in Richmond, states, "I no longer believe we are hunting a mere runaway. The devices discovered in the hills suggest a mind of considerable sophistication. Johnson's boy who returned from the last expedition spoke of paths that lead to nowhere, of sounds that draw men forward only to cease when approached, of ingenious traps that appear designed not to kill, but to contain." 3 more men went missing last week after following what they believed were human tracks near the old sulfur spring. I begin to wonder if we have underestimated what we face in those mountains. In the autumn of 1852, a slave catcher from North Carolina named Ezekiel Monroe arrived in McDowell County with a reputation for never having failed to retrieve his quarry. His methods were reportedly brutal but effective, and he brought with him a team of 6 men and a pack of trained hunting dogs. County records indicate that Monroe was hired by a consortium of local plantation owners, including relatives of the missing Thomas Hale, who by this time was presumed dead. Monroe spent 2 weeks preparing for his expedition, interviewing those who had known Elijah and studying what limited maps existed of the more remote mountain regions. On October 12th, Monroe and his party set out with great confidence, publicly declaring that they would return within 10 days with either Elijah Brown or proof of his demise. Sarah Hale's diary entry from this period reveals the community's mixed feelings. There is much talk of Monroe's expedition. Some speak with hope, others with doubt. I find myself strangely ambivalent. Thomas has been gone for over a year now, and I have made my peace with his absence. There is something unseemly about this continued pursuit, as though we are playing a game whose rules we do not understand against an opponent we have consistently underestimated. After 12 days without word from Monroe, concern began to spread. A local hunting party volunteered to follow the slave catcher's trail, but returned after less than a day, reporting that the forest seemed unusually silent, with no signs of wildlife or natural sounds. One hunter described it as walking into a painting of a forest rather than the forest itself. By the end of October, Monroe and his entire party were officially declared missing. More significantly, their disappearance marked the end of organized attempts to capture Elijah Brown. The mountain regions where he was believed to reside became places that respectable people simply avoided. Throughout 1853 and 54, stories continued to circulate about strange configurations of rope, wood, and metal found in the deeper mountain hollows. A surveyor working for a Richmond-based mining company filed a report describing what appeared to be a complex series of interconnected mechanisms spanning several acres of forest, as though the entire landscape had been subtly modified to serve as components in some grand machine whose purpose I could not discern. The surveyor requested reassignment shortly thereafter, citing personal concerns about the safety of the region. What makes the case of Elijah Brown particularly compelling is the discovery made in 1967 during an archaeological survey of the area in preparation for a now abandoned highway project. In a remote hollow near the West Virginia border, researchers uncovered the remnants of what appeared to be a carefully constructed living space built into the side of the mountain. Carbon dating of artifacts found at the site placed its occupation between approximately 1850 and 1870. What drew immediate attention, however, were the sophisticated mechanical systems found throughout the site and the surrounding forest. Dr. Margaret Donovan, the lead archaeologist on the project, described the findings in her subsequently suppressed report. The engineering skill evident in these constructions far exceeds what one would expect from a person with limited formal education in the mid-19th century. We have identified what appear to be early alarm systems using counterweighted branches to signal movement, false trails designed to lead to dead ends or circular paths, and most disturbingly, a series of concealed pits and enclosures that seem designed for temporary human containment rather than as lethal traps. Most remarkable is the interconnected nature of these mechanisms, suggesting they were components of a larger system rather than isolated traps. Among the artifacts recovered were fragments of a journal written on scraps of leather and tree bark. Though much of the text was illegible due to environmental damage, certain passages remained decipherable. One such fragment, now housed in the West Virginia State Museum's restricted collection, reads, "They do not understand that the mountain itself can be made to serve as both fortress and weapon. Master Hale taught me well the principles of mechanical advantage, never imagining I would apply these lessons to secure my freedom. Each man who comes seeking me now serves as both experiment and refinement. I observe their patterns, their tendencies, their weaknesses. Each failure on their part improves my understanding." Perhaps the most chilling discovery was a small bound book found in what appeared to be the main living quarters of the site. The book contained detailed observations of human behavior under conditions of disorientation and isolation. Entries described how individuals reacted to particular stimuli, how long they could endure certain conditions before their resolve deteriorated, and methods of leveraging psychological weaknesses. Dr. Donovan's notes indicate that the book appeared to be a methodical study of how to break a human being's will without resorting to physical violence, knowledge that Elijah Brown would have acquired firsthand during his years of enslavement. By 1855, the disappearances had largely ceased, primarily because expeditions into certain regions of the mountains had become exceedingly rare. Local folklore established boundaries beyond which people simply did not venture. Maps from this period sometimes included vaguely defined areas, marked only with phrases such as unfavorable terrain or not suitable for settlement. A schoolteacher's journal from 1858 referenced local children's belief that the mountain man watches from the trees, taking those who hunt what is not theirs to hunt. What ultimately became of Elijah Brown remains unknown. No death record exists, nor is there evidence that he ever left the Appalachian region. The last credible account of someone who might have been Elijah comes from a church registry in a small community on the Virginia side of the mountains, where in 1871 a pastor recorded meeting an elderly colored man who came down from the high country carrying tools of remarkable craftsmanship. He spoke little, but displayed great knowledge of the forest and its ways. When asked his name, he smiled in a manner I found both gentle and somewhat unsettling, and replied that names were things given by masters, and he had left his behind on the mountain. The archaeological site discovered in 1967 was thoroughly documented before being reburied at the insistence of state officials who cited concerns about treasure hunters and vandalism. Dr. Donovan's complete findings were filed with restricted access, ostensibly to protect the site, though rumors among academic circles suggested the restrictions had more to do with the disturbing implications of what was found. In a private letter to a colleague discovered after her death in 1983, Donovan wrote, "What we uncovered was not merely the refuge of an escaped slave, but evidence of an extraordinary mind that developed a systematic approach to psychological warfare a century before such concepts were formally recognized. The traps were never primarily physical. They were elaborate mechanisms designed to isolate, disorient, and ultimately break the will of those who entered his domain. The truly haunting aspect is how precisely he seems to have understood the minds of his pursuers, turning their own expectations and fears against them. In 1859, Sarah Hale sold the plantation and relocated to Philadelphia, where she lived with relatives until her death in 1876. Her final diary entry regarding her husband reads simply, "Today, I finally accepted the papers declaring Thomas legally dead. 8 years seems sufficient time, even for a man of his determination. I sometimes wonder if he found what he was looking for in those mountains, or if what he sought found him instead. There are nights when I still dream of him, not calling out as before, but sitting quietly in a dark place, as though waiting for something only he can perceive." Local histories compiled in the early 1900s contain occasional references to strange configurations of branches, rope, and metal found in the more remote hollows, though most were attributed to the peculiar geological formations common to the region or to the creative interpretations of isolated mountain communities. In 1958, during timber surveys in the region, workers reported uncovering a series of unusual structures built into the landscape, including what one worker described as a kind of wooden machinery that seemed to grow from the trees themselves. Company records indicate that work in the area was abandoned shortly thereafter due to unsafe ground conditions, though personal accounts from workers suggested the decision had more to do with a collective unease that developed among the crew. One worker's letter to his family, preserved in a local historical collection, mentions feeling watched from every direction and hearing sounds like wooden gears turning inside the mountain itself. What makes the case of Elijah Brown particularly notable in the study of historical disappearances is not merely the number of people who vanished, estimated at between 17 and 23 individuals over a 4-year period, but the psychological impact these vanishings had on the surrounding communities. By this time, the story of Elijah Brown and the disappearances had largely faded from public memory, preserved primarily in family histories and local folklore. Unlike many historical cases where threats were externalized as supernatural or bestial, the fear that developed around the Appalachian disappearances was distinctly centered on human ingenuity. Contemporary accounts suggest a growing awareness that they were not dealing with a wild beast or vengeful spirit, but with a human mind that had learned to weaponize the landscape itself. A journal kept by Dr. Samuel Pierce, who served as physician to several prominent families in the region during this period, contains observations about what he termed a contagion of dread that spread through the community. "It is not the fear of death that disturbs them most," he wrote in February of 1854, "but the uncertainty of what fate befell those who disappeared. Many have expressed to me privately that they would prefer confirmation of their loved ones' deaths rather than this unending ambiguity. Some speak of dreams in which they encounter family members living in strange conditions beneath the mountains, neither dead nor truly alive, existing in a state of perpetual capture." Archaeological evidence suggests that Elijah Brown likely survived in the mountains for at least 20 years after his escape, developing increasingly sophisticated methods for ensuring his safety and autonomy. The systems discovered in 1967 indicate that he eventually established a network of surveillance and defensive measures covering several square miles of mountain territory, effectively creating what modern military analysts might term a denied area, a space where he maintained absolute tactical advantage over any who entered. The psychological dimension of Elijah's methods is perhaps best illustrated by a report filed by one of the few members of Monroe's party who was eventually found. The man, identified in county records only as Richardson, was discovered wandering near a small settlement 30 miles from where the expedition had entered the mountains. According to the local doctor who treated him, Richardson was severely dehydrated and exhibiting signs of extreme mental distress. During moments of lucidity, he described being led in circles for days by sounds and signs that seemed to promise imminent success in their hunt. "We were being studied," he reportedly told the doctor. "Each trap we avoided led us toward another we didn't see until too late. Not to kill us, he could have done that at any time, but to separate us, to make us experience what he had experienced, to make us understand what it means to be hunted." Richardson died 3 days later, having never provided a coherent account of what happened to the rest of the expedition. His final words, as recorded by the attending physician, were, "He built something up there that's more than traps. He built a place where the hunter becomes the hunted, where the mountain itself remembers what was done and turns it back upon the doer." In the decades that followed, as the direct memory of the disappearances faded, the story of Elijah Brown transformed within local folklore. By the early 1900s, he had become something of an ambiguous legend, neither hero nor villain, but a symbol of the mountain's resistance to human presumption. Stories told to children warned against venturing too deep into certain hollows, not because a monster lurked there, but because those places remember how to trap the unwary. What began as a case of a man fleeing bondage evolved into a broader metaphorical warning about the consequences of pursuing others beyond the boundaries of civilization's protections. The final documented connection to the historical Elijah Brown came in 1969, when a descendant of Thomas Hale, researching family history, discovered a sealed envelope in a collection of papers inherited from Sarah Hale. Inside was a crude map drawn on animal hide, showing what appeared to be specific locations in the mountain region where the disappearances had occurred. Marked at various points were small symbols resembling the mechanical systems discovered at the archaeological site. Along the edge of the map, written in faded ink, were the words, "Not all who wander these paths are truly lost. Some are exactly where they have chosen to be." The handwriting did not match samples of Thomas Hale's writing preserved in other documents. The Hale descendant reportedly turned the map over to state authorities, who conducted a brief investigation but found nothing conclusive. The map itself was subsequently lost during an office relocation in 1972. Its brief appearance and disappearance added a final layer of ambiguity to a case already shrouded in uncertainty, a fitting conclusion to a story defined by questions that echo but never resolve, by seekers who never return, and by a landscape that seems to hold secrets just beyond the reach of full understanding. Today, certain areas of the Appalachian Mountains in McDowell County remain surprisingly undeveloped, despite their natural beauty and potential economic value. Local residents occasionally report finding unusual configurations of weathered wood and rusted metal deep in the forests, though most attribute these to the remains of abandoned mining operations or the natural processes of forest growth around human artifacts. Yet there persists in local culture a certain hesitancy about venturing too far into particular hollows or straying from established paths. A subtle inheritance from a time when the mountains were not merely a landscape to be traversed, but a domain where human ingenuity had learned to turn the hunter's own nature against him. Perhaps what makes the case of Elijah Brown and his pursuers so enduringly disturbing is not what we know, but what remains eternally beyond our understanding. The precise nature of what occurred in those mountain hollows, the exact fate of those who disappeared, and most significantly, the experience of being gradually made aware that one has wandered into an environment where every step, every decision, every instinct has been anticipated and incorporated into a design whose purpose is not merely to capture, but to transform the very relationship between pursuer and pursued. The true horror lies not in the possibility of death, but in the realization that one has become unwittingly enmeshed in another mind's carefully constructed reality. a reality designed to teach a lesson that only becomes clear when it is already too late to escape it. In the winter of 1964, a survey team attempting to map potential routes for a new forestry road reported an experience that echoes those described over a century earlier. After several days working in a particularly remote area, team members began to notice subtle signs of human modification in the landscape. Branches that appeared to have been deliberately positioned, stones arranged in patterns that seemed to direct movement along certain paths. The team leader's report describes a growing sense that they were being channeled towards something or away from something. It was impossible to determine which. The survey was abandoned when equipment began to malfunction in ways that defied explanation, and team members reported hearing what sounded like mechanical movements inside the dense forest where no machinery should have been. The final entry in the team leader's journal, dated February 12, 1964, reads, "There is intelligence in this design, a pattern that reveals itself only when you've gone too far to turn back. I understand now why the old-timers warn against certain hollows, not because of bears or falls, but because there are places in these mountains that were shaped by a mind that learned all too well how to invert the relationship between captor and captive. We're pulling out tomorrow. Official explanation will cite terrain unsuitable for development. The truth is something else entirely. Some territories remain unclaimed for good reason. They already belong to someone who understood possession in ways we have forgotten. What remains particularly striking about the Elijah Brown case is the absence of physical violence in the historical record. Despite the disappearance of numerous individuals over several years, not a single body was ever recovered, nor was there evidence of conventional attacks or killings. This absence itself becomes a central element of the psychological horror that surrounded the case, the complete uncertainty about the fate of those who vanished. In the words of historian Dr. Eleanor Jenkins, who studied the case extensively in the 1950s, the terror that gripped these communities wasn't rooted in confirmed atrocities, but in the yawning void of information. There is something uniquely disturbing about a threat that leaves no bodies, only absences. Local folklore preserved in the McDowell County Historical Society's archives include stories of strange sounds sometimes heard from deep within certain mountain hollows, rhythmic creaking and groaning described as resembling the operation of large wooden machinery. One account, recorded from an elderly resident in 1938, describes hunters occasionally hearing what sounded like great wooden gears turning beneath the earth, particularly after heavy rains had saturated the ground. These stories persisted well into the 20th century, long after any direct memory of Elijah Brown had faded from public consciousness. In 1868, a geologist from the University of Pennsylvania, conducting a survey of the region's coal deposits, reported discovering what appeared to be an elaborate system of wooden channels and reservoirs built into a steep hillside. His notes described the construction as ingeniously designed to collect and redirect rainwater to power what must be mechanisms concealed beneath the surface. The geologist attempted to investigate further, but was prevented by local guides who refused to remain in the area after sundown. His subsequent report to the university makes only passing reference to these findings, focusing instead on the more conventional aspects of his geological survey. Perhaps most unsettling are the occasional reports, spanning more than a century, of lone travelers encountering an elderly black man on rarely used mountain paths. A figure who appears suddenly, offers cryptic advice about which routes to avoid, and disappears with equal abruptness. The most recent such account dates from 1958, when a hiker separated from his group reported being guided back to a main trail by an old man who seemed to materialize from the trees themselves, and who spoke with detailed knowledge about the mountain's hidden dangers. The description, an elderly man carrying finely crafted tools and speaking with unusual formal precision, bears striking similarity to accounts dating back to the 1870s. Historical researcher James Whittaker, who spent 3 summers in the region between 1965 and 68, attempting to piece together the full story, concluded his unpublished manuscript with an observation that captures the enduring power of the case. What Elijah Brown created in these mountains was not merely a series of traps for those who pursued him, but a living legacy of psychological warfare that continues to resonate in the collective consciousness of the region. He transformed a space of vulnerability into one of power, inverting the very dynamics of pursuit and capture that had defined his existence. In doing so, he created something that transcended his individual lifetime, a system that continues to operate on both the physical landscape and the psychological terrain of all who encounter it. The archaeological evidence suggests that Elijah survived into at least the 1870s, gradually expanding and refining his network of surveillance and defensive mechanisms throughout a significant portion of the mountain region. What is particularly remarkable about the constructions discovered in 1967 is their durability and integration with the natural environment. Many of the mechanisms were designed to be maintained and partially powered by natural processes. Rainfall, seasonal growth of vegetation, even the movement of wildlife through the forest. Dr. Donovan's suppressed report noted that some components appeared to have been regularly maintained until at least the early 1900s, suggesting that someone, whether Elijah himself or others who came after him, continued to preserve and operate the system long after the initial disappearances had ceased. The psychological impact of the disappearances extended far beyond the immediate region. A letter from a Richmond businessman to his associate in Charleston, dated May 1855, references the troubling situation in the western mountains and expresses concern about the implications of a man of servile status developing such formidable means of resistance. The letter goes on to suggest that details of the case should be carefully controlled to prevent the spread of dangerous ideas among the general enslaved population. This attempt at suppression appears to have been largely successful in formal historical records, which contain remarkably few references to the case, despite its significant impact on the region. Correspondence preserved in various historical collections reveals that by 1855 the case had become a topic of uneasy discussion among plantation owners throughout Virginia and the Carolinas. However, oral traditions within both Black and Appalachian communities preserved the essence of the story, often transforming Elijah into a figure of almost mythic significance. Not a vengeful killer, but a symbol of ingenious resistance against overwhelming power. In some versions recorded by folklorists in the early 20th century, Elijah is described as having learned the language of the mountains themselves, enabling him to bend the forest to his will and make the hills rise up against those who meant him harm. The journal fragments recovered from the archaeological site provide tantalizing glimpses into Elijah's own perspective. One partially preserved passage reads, "The master's greatest error was in teaching me to understand mechanisms while believing I could not understand freedom. Each pulley and lever I constructed for his convenience taught me the principles I now apply to my defense. The irony does not escape me." Another fragment, dated approximately 1857 based on contextual references, states, "Today, I observed the party from the Eastern Valley triggering the false trail sequence. Their confusion when the path disappeared before their eyes confirmed the effectiveness of the design. They turned back rather than proceeding to the containment area, which suggests further refinements are needed in the transitional section." These writings reveal not just technical ingenuity, but a profound psychological insight. Elijah appears to have developed a sophisticated understanding of how fear operates in the human mind, particularly the fear of the unknown and unseen. His systems were designed not merely to capture or repel intruders, but to create an environment of pervasive uncertainty and disorientation, conditions he himself had experienced during his years of enslavement, now weaponized against those who represented the system that had oppressed him. Dr. Whitaker's research in the 1960s uncovered several accounts from descendants of enslaved individuals who had known Elijah on the Hale plantation. These oral histories, passed down through generations, described him as a man of few words but intense observation, who watched everything, remembered everything. One account relates that Elijah had been forced to design and build various restraint devices used on the plantation, an experience that would have given him intimate knowledge of how confinement affected the human psyche, knowledge he would later invert in his mountain domain. The final confirmed historical reference to someone who might have been Elijah comes from a church record in 1880, when a pastor in a small Virginia community noted performing a burial service for an elderly colored man known to the mountain folk as a craftsman of remarkable skill, who lived alone in the high country for many years. The pastor recorded that few attended the service, but that there was an unusual atmosphere of respect, even among those who would normally show little concern for the passing of a man of his race. The grave was unmarked, and its location has been lost to time. In 1969, shortly after the archaeological findings, and shortly before his own death, Dr. Whitaker conducted an interview with an elderly resident of McDowell County, who claimed his grandfather had once encountered Elijah in the mountains sometime around 1875. According to this account, the grandfather, then a young man hunting in a remote area, became disoriented and feared he would not find his way back before nightfall. He reported being approached by an elderly black man who seemed to appear from nowhere and who guided him to a vantage point from which he could reorient himself. Before departing, the guide allegedly told the young hunter, "Remember that these mountains have learned who belongs here and who does not. They have become very good at making distinctions." The elderly resident concluded his account by noting that his grandfather had refused to hunt in that region ever again, despite having previously favored it. The story of Elijah Brown and his mountain domain represents a unique intersection of historical trauma, human ingenuity, and psychological warfare. Unlike many historical horror narratives that rely on supernatural elements or explicit violence, the terror in this case emerges from a subtle inversion of power dynamics and a profound uncertainty about the fate of those who disappeared. It speaks to a form of resistance that operates not through direct confrontation, but through the strategic manipulation of environment and perception, turning the very landscape into both witness and weapon. For modern visitors to certain remote areas of the Appalachian Mountains, there remains a subtle but persistent sense of being observed, of moving through a landscape that holds memories beyond human understanding. Hikers occasionally report finding weathered wooden structures that seem to serve no obvious purpose, or paths that appear well-defined but lead nowhere. Local guides still warn against venturing too far from established trails in specific hollows, particularly as daylight wanes. These warnings are generally attributed to practical concerns about rugged terrain and the dangers of becoming lost, but beneath them runs a deeper current of unease, a collective memory of a time when the mountains themselves seemed to conspire with one man against those who pursued him. In 1968, a forest ranger patrolling a rarely visited section of what is now part of the Monongahela National Forest reported finding a small clearing containing what appeared to be the remains of wooden machinery, gears, pulleys, and counterweights crafted from local hardwood and worn smooth by decades of operation. According to his report, the mechanisms seemed designed to be triggered by disturbances in the surrounding forest, potentially alerting someone to the presence of intruders. The ranger noted that despite the apparent age of the constructions, certain components showed signs of much more recent maintenance. His request for a more thorough investigation was denied by regional authorities, who cited budget constraints and higher priorities elsewhere. He describes feeling an acute sense of trespassing in a place that, despite being public land, retained a powerful sense of private ownership. More disturbing was his observation that as he was examining the mechanisms, he became aware of subtle movements in the surrounding forest that seemed to be evaluating my presence, determining whether I represented a threat. The journal entry concludes, "I have spent 30 years in these mountains and considered myself intimately familiar with their moods and characteristics." The ranger's personal journal, donated to the State Historical Society after his death in 1989, contains a more detailed account of the discovery. "Today, I discovered I have been permitted to know only what something older and wiser has allowed me to know." Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for Elijah Brown comes from the fragments of his own journal, in a passage dated approximately 1860 based on contextual references. They came to these mountains believing they were hunters pursuing prey. I have constructed a reality in which that certainty is systematically dismantled. Each mechanism, each false trail, each moment of disorientation serves not merely to protect me, but to educate them in the nature of captivity. Some begin to understand in those moments when they realize they have been moving not of their own volition, but according to a design they cannot perceive. It is in that moment of understanding that they experience what I experienced for 27 years, the knowledge that one's movements, choices, and destiny are controlled by another's will. Today, certain areas of McDowell County remain surprisingly undeveloped, despite economic pressures that have transformed much of the surrounding region. Local residents speak of these areas with a mixture of pride and unease, territories that have resisted the encroachment of modern development through a combination of rugged terrain and what one elderly resident described in a 1992 oral history project as a certain unwillingness to be claimed. Development projects in these areas have a curious history of encountering unexpected difficulties. Equipment malfunctions, surveying discrepancies, workers reporting feelings of disorientation or being watched. In 2001, a team from West Virginia University attempted to conduct a comprehensive archaeological survey of one such area, using modern technology to map subsurface anomalies that might indicate historical human activity. Their equipment detected what appeared to be an extensive network of underground structures and tunnels spanning several acres. However, when excavation began at the most promising site, they discovered only natural geological formations. Though several team members reported that the formations had an unusual quality of appearing almost deliberately arranged, as though natural processes had been subtly guided over time. The project's lead archaeologist, in a presentation to colleagues that was notably absent from official publications, described the experience as encountering a landscape that actively resists investigation, that seems to shift between revealing and concealing according to some logic we could not discern. The survey was abandoned after 3 weeks, ostensibly due to funding constraints, though internal communications suggest a growing unease among team members about what one described as the palpable sense of intrusion we felt, not as though we were unwelcome visitors, but as though we were unwitting participants in an experiment whose parameters we did not understand. For those who study the intersection of landscape, memory, and power, the case of Elijah Brown represents something profound. A rare historical instance in which an individual transformed not merely their personal circumstances, but the very nature of a territorial space, inverting established power dynamics so completely that the effects continue to resonate more than a century and a half later. It suggests that landscapes can become repositories, not just of events, but of intentions, participants in human dramas whose roles extend far beyond passive setting. As we conclude this exploration of one of Appalachia's most disturbing historical cases, we are left with more questions than answers. Questions about the precise fate of those who disappeared, about the extent and nature of Elijah's domain, about whether the systems he created truly could have continued to function long after his death. Perhaps it is fitting that these questions remain unanswered, that the story resists complete resolution, just as certain hollows in the mountains continue to resist complete exploration. In that uncertainty lies the true power of the narrative, a reminder that some territories, both geographical and psychological, retain their secrets not through supernatural agency, but through the profound imprint of human will and ingenuity turned toward the singular purpose of never being captured again. The final word might best be left to Sarah Hale, who in 1868, 15 years after her husband's disappearance, wrote in her diary, "I dreamed of Thomas again last night. Not calling out or trapped as in previous dreams, but sitting quietly in a small wooden room, his expression one of perfect comprehension. Around him were mechanical devices of a design I did not recognize. He looked directly at me and said, 'I understand now what he wanted me to understand.' When I asked what he meant, he replied, 'What it means to belong to another's design.' I woke with the peculiar certainty that somewhere in those mountains Thomas still exists, not living as we understand it, but preserved within a system designed to teach a lesson that has no end.